In the final days of February 2022, a line was crossed even if most people didn't realize it. Just after Russian forces entered Ukraine, the West deployed what it believed was its ultimate advantage. Not armies, not weapons, but access. Russia was disconnected from SWIFT, the unseen infrastructure that keeps the global economy functioning, the system banks use to communicate, settle payments, and keep trade moving. Policymakers treated it as final. Commentators called it unstoppable. A financial strike so severe it would end the war through economic collapse rather than combat. For a brief period, the strategy seemed flawless. But behind the confidence, a much larger shift was taking place, because this wasn't merely a sanction, it was a signal, a demonstration of how centralized the modern financial system truly is, and what happens once that centralization is used as a weapon. This story isn't about good actors and bad actors. It isn't about nationalism or ideology, and it isn't limited to one conflict. It's about structure. A structure that follows the same pattern every time power is enforced through shared systems. It starts with certainty, moves through shock, and ends with decentralization, slow, deliberate, and permanent. History doesn't announce collapse. It allows decay, and decay never looks extreme at first. It looks reasonable, responsible, necessary, until the system everyone trusted begins to fail under its own weight. Because the real question of February 2022 was never asked out loud, what if this move didn't end the system's enemies but started the end of the system itself? For decades, SWIFT was never meant to be noticed. It didn't print money, it didn't lend money, it didn't make policy, it simply connected banks quietly, efficiently, invisibly. 11,000 financial institutions, over 200 countries. Trillions of dollars moving every single day. Not because SWIFT moved the money, but because it carried the message that made the movement possible. If money is blood, SWIFT was the nervous system. When a bank in New York needed to pay a bank in Tokyo, SWIFT carried the instruction. When oil moved from the Middle East to Europe, when machinery moved from Asia to America, when debts were settled and contracts honored, SWIFT was there, unseen, unquestioned. It became so reliable that no one planned for life without it. That invisibility was its power. By the early 2000s, global trade wasn't just conducted in dollars, it was conducted through systems that assumed access to dollar-based networks, correspondent banking, clearing through New York, settlement tied to institutions that all spoke the same financial language, and SWIFT was the translator. So when Western leaders discussed cutting Russia off, they weren't guessing. They believed they were removing oxygen. No SWIFT meant no payments. No payments meant no trade. No trade meant economic suffocation. This wasn't theory. Smaller countries had already collapsed under similar pressure. Iran had been crippled, banks had folded, inflation had exploded. The lesson policymakers thought they had learned was simple. Access equals survival. And in that moment, SWIFT didn't look like infrastructure. It looked like a kill switch. Because no country survives without oxygen, the expectations were clear, public, confident. Within hours of the announcement, forecasts flooded in. The ruble would collapse, Russian banks would fail, ATMs would run dry, inflation would spiral, oligarchs would panic, citizens would take to the streets. Pressure would build from the inside until the Kremlin had no choice but to retreat. This was presented as inevitability, not speculation. Analysts ran the models, commentators repeated the numbers, headlines spoke in absolutes. A modern economy, cut off from the global financial system, could not function. No trade finance. No access to reserves, no trust. The collapse wasn't a question of if, only how fast. Some predicted weeks, others gave it months. The logic felt airtight. Russia depended on exports, exports depended on payments, payments depended on SWIFT. Remove the middle, and the structure falls. This was economic gravity. Pull the support away, and everything above it comes down. Even dissenting voices were muted. Any suggestion that Russia might adapt was brushed aside. Too integrated, too exposed, too late. Globalization had made exit impossible. History, according to the experts, was over. And for a brief moment, the numbers seemed to agree. The ruble plunged, markets halted, capital controls were rushed into place, panic was visible. Western media declared the strategy a success almost immediately. But here's the mistake that gets repeated every time power feels absolute. Predictions assume the system stays still. They assume behavior freezes. They assume targets accept the rules even after they've been broken. They assume that when pressure is applied, the only response is collapse. But history rarely obeys predictions. Then something strange happened. The collapse didn't continue. After the initial shock, the ruble stopped falling. Then it stabilized. Then, quietly, it began to recover. Interest rates were raised. Capital controls tightened. Energy exports kept flowing. Buyers still needed oil and gas, and Russia was still willing to sell. Trade didn't disappear. It rerouted. Payments that once moved through familiar Western channels began moving through unfamiliar ones. Deals were renegotiated. Currencies shifted. Yuan, rupees, rubles replaced dollars and euros in transactions that had always assumed Western settlement. Within months, the story Western audiences were expecting simply failed to arrive. There was no financial implosion, no mass unrest, no political collapse. The Russian economy shrank, then adapted, then stabilized. By the end of the year, growth returned. This wasn't supposed to be possible. A country cut off from SWIFT was supposed to suffocate. Instead, Russia adjusted its breathing. Slower, more constrained, but alive, and that's when the mood changed. Because if the financial nuclear option didn't work the way it was supposed to, then something was wrong with the assumption behind it. Either Russia was an exception, or the system wasn't as absolute as everyone believed. Markets noticed, governments noticed, central banks noticed. The confidence that had filled headlines in February gave way to something else by summer. Unease, because power only feels permanent until it's tested. And once tested, it's never quite the same again. If this didn't work on Russia, what else won't it work on? At first, it was framed as a Russian problem, a punishment for a single country, a response to a single war, a one-off act meant to restore order. But the real audience was never Moscow. It was everyone else. Every finance minister, every central banker, every country holding reserves they didn't control, every nation whose trade depended on systems they didn't own. Because the message sent in February 2022 wasn't just Russia is punished. The message was, this system can be turned off. Not by courts, not by treaties, not by global consensus, but by political decision. $300 billion in reserves were frozen overnight. Not seized in war, not defaulted on, simply locked. Money that was supposed to be untouchable, sovereign, neutral, safe, suddenly wasn't. And everyone understood what that meant. If it could happen to Russia, it could happen to anyone. Allies, neutrals, trade partners, countries that weren't at war with the West, but might one day disagree with it. This wasn't strength. It was exposure. The SWIFT cutoff revealed a truth that had always been there, but never acknowledged out loud. The global financial system wasn't neutral. It wasn't rules-based. It was permission-based. And permission can be revoked. That realization didn't cause panic. It caused calculation. Quiet meetings, policy reviews, internal memos that never made headlines. No country announced a rebellion. No one gave speeches. They just started planning exits, because systems don't collapse when they're attacked. They collapse when people stop trusting them, and everyone understood the warning. There is a rule that repeats itself every time power becomes concentrated in a system everyone else depends on. It doesn't announce itself, it isn't written down, but it governs empires as reliably as gravity. When control feels total, it invites use. When it's used, it creates fear. And fear always produces alternatives. This is the hidden rule of financial power. At first, dominance looks stable, the system works, trade flows, confidence builds. Everyone benefits as long as they follow the rules. The dominant power believes this proves legitimacy, that its position is natural, earned, permanent. But the moment that system is weaponized, everything changes. Because infrastructure is only trusted when it's boring. When it becomes a tool of punishment, it stops being infrastructure and starts being a threat. And threats don't inspire loyalty. They inspire contingency planning. No one abandons a system because they hate it. They abandon it because they fear being trapped inside it. This is where history always turns. Alternatives don't appear overnight. They start as backups. Secondary channels. Emergency plans that feel unnecessary until they aren't. At first, they're inefficient, expensive, incomplete. But once built, they don't disappear. They improve. They spread. They attract others who are asking the same quiet question. What happens if this is used on us? The dominant power usually doesn't notice this phase, because nothing looks broken yet. The old system still works, the numbers still look strong, transactions still flow, control feels intact. But beneath the surface, dependence is being replaced with optionality. And once a system becomes optional, its decline is no longer theoretical. Power doesn't vanish, it leaks. In 1914, Britain stood exactly where America believes it stands today. The British pound was the world's reserve currency. London was the center of global finance. International trade cleared through British banks. British institutions held foreign reserves. And for decades, this dominance felt permanent. Then war broke out. When World War I began, Britain made a decision that felt justified, even necessary. It passed laws allowing the government to freeze and seize German-owned assets across the empire. Bank accounts, businesses, ships, property, anything connected to the enemy was suddenly fair game. At the time, this was seen as genius. Germany was economically crippled. Its companies were cut off, its trade collapsed. Britain believed it had discovered a new kind of warfare, one that could win conflicts without firing a shot. But something subtle happened next. Neutral countries were watching. They saw that financial contracts were no longer sacred. That money held in London was only safe if Britain approved of your politics. That reserves could be frozen not because of default or invasion, but because of alignment. This shattered an unspoken rule of global finance. After the war, those neutral countries didn't rebel, they didn't confront Britain, they did something far more dangerous. They diversified. Gold holdings increased. Reserves shifted to New York. Paris gained relevance. London slowly lost exclusivity. Trust didn't disappear overnight, it drained away. By the 1,920 seconds, American banks were rising. By the 1,930 seconds, the pound was under pressure. And by 1944, at Bretton Woods, the decision was formalized. The dollar replaced the pound as the world's reserve currency. Britain didn't fall because it lost a war. It fell because it taught the world a lesson it could never unteach. And the world took notes. In 1979, the United States faced a crisis that felt personal, public, and humiliating. American hostages were taken in Tehran. The images spread around the world. Pressure mounted. And Washington responded with a move that seemed decisive and moral. It froze Iran's assets held in U.S. banks, billions of dollars locked with the stroke of a pen. The tactic worked. Iran's economy strained, inflation surged, access to dollars vanished, the pressure contributed to negotiations, and eventually the hostages were released. In the short term, it looked like a textbook success. Financial power had forced political compliance. But once again, the real consequences weren't immediate. They were observational. Oil-producing nations, sovereign wealth funds, and neutral governments quietly absorbed the lesson. If Iranian reserves could be frozen by executive order, then any reserves held in New York were conditional. Sovereign money wasn't truly sovereign if it sat inside someone else's system. This realization didn't trigger panic selling, it triggered reallocation. Throughout the 1,980 seconds, major oil exporters reduced their exposure to U.S. banks. Gold holdings increased. Accounts were spread across London, Zurich, and Asia. Currency baskets replaced dollar exclusivity. The dollar remained dominant, but something essential had cracked. Trust. The freeze had solved a crisis, but it rewired global behavior. Countries began treating the dollar not as neutral infrastructure, but as a political instrument, useful, powerful, and dangerous. And once money is seen as conditional, it's never held the same way again. Trust once broken never fully returns. In 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, the response from the West was firm but restrained. Sanctions were imposed, officials were targeted, certain banks were restricted, assets were frozen. It was meant to send a signal without triggering a full rupture. Russia would feel pressure, but the global system would remain intact. This was described as balance. In reality, it was a warning shot. Russia wasn't cut off from SWIFT. Trade didn't stop. Energy still flowed. The damage was real, but survivable, and that survivability mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Because for the first time, Russia had proof that financial access could be politicized, and time to do something about it. What followed wasn't dramatic. There were no public announcements, no emergency speeches, just a quiet, methodical shift. Dollar reserves were reduced, gold reserves were increased. Trade agreements were renegotiated. Payment infrastructure was redesigned. Alternatives were tested, refined, and scaled. Western analysts largely dismissed these moves. Russia was still too integrated, they said, too dependent, too exposed. Any attempt to decouple would be too costly to sustain. But that was the mistake. Preparation doesn't look like defiance. It looks like redundancy. It looks inefficient. It looks unnecessary right up until the moment it isn't. The sanctions of 2014 didn't break Russia. They trained it. They gave Moscow 8 years to rehearse for a future everyone else assumed would never come. And when that future arrived in 2022, Russia wasn't improvising. It was executing a plan that had been written quietly, patiently, years earlier. Preparation looks invisible until it's finished. On February 26, 2022, the restraint vanished. This time, the West didn't signal. It struck. Major Russian banks were cut off from SWIFT. Hundreds of billions of dollars in central bank reserves were frozen overnight. Not during negotiations. Not after years of escalation. Instantly. Completely. Publicly. This was the nuclear option. Financial warfare crossed a line that had existed mostly unspoken for generations. Money that had always been treated as neutral was no longer neutral. Reserves that were supposed to be untouchable were suddenly locked behind political doors. The immediate effects were dramatic. The ruble collapsed, markets shut down, lines formed at ATMs, panic rippled through the country. Western media declared economic victory within days. The strategy appeared to be working exactly as designed. But something else happened at the same time. Every country watching understood that this wasn't just punishment. It was precedent. $300 billion frozen with no warning, no trial, no recourse. Not seized because of default, not lost because of war. Simply rendered inaccessible because of political alignment. That realization landed far beyond Russia. It landed in Beijing, Riyadh, New Delhi, Brasilia, in capitals that weren't enemies of the West but weren't fully under its control either. Because the question was no longer theoretical. If reserves could be frozen once, they could be frozen again. And if access to the global financial system could be revoked for political reasons, then participation itself carried hidden risk. This wasn't just a sanction. It was a message. And that's when the clock started. What happened next wasn't chaos. It was structure. Because this wasn't the first time a dominant power had reached for financial weapons, and history had already mapped what comes after. Not as theory, as sequence. It always begins the same way. First, one country gains control over a system everyone else depends on. Payments, trade, reserves. The pipes that move value across borders. At this stage, dominance feels earned, useful, benevolent. Then comes weaponization. The system is used to punish enemies. At first, carefully, selectively, with justification. Each use feels necessary. Each success reinforces confidence. But weaponization changes behavior. Targets don't surrender forever. They adapt. They build alternatives, slower channels, new routes, different currencies. Nothing dramatic at first, just enough to survive. That's when the most important shift happened. Neutral countries start watching more closely, not because they oppose the dominant power, but because they don't want to depend on it. They hedge. Quietly, incrementally, they reduce exposure before they're forced to. And finally, the weapon loses power, not because the system collapses overnight, but because it no longer commands exclusivity. It still exists, it still functions, but it no longer controls outcomes the way it once did. This is the backfire. The dominant power believes it's enforcing order. In reality, it's teaching the world how to escape. Every sanction becomes a tutorial. Every freeze becomes a warning. Every cutoff becomes motivation. Empires don't fall when they lose wars. They fall when their tools stop working. Every empire thinks this time is different. For decades, control over the dollar and control over global payments were treated as separate things. They weren't. The dollar became dominant because it sat at the center of everything: trade, energy, debt, reserves. And because most international transactions cleared through U.S. banks, access to dollars meant access to the system itself. SWIFT didn't belong to the United States on paper, but it couldn't function without dollar clearing. And dollar clearing couldn't happen without American permission. At first, this power was used sparingly. After the Cold War, sanctions were framed as tools of last resort: terrorist networks, rogue states, narrow targets. The idea was containment, not coercion. But success breeds temptation. After 9/11, financial surveillance expanded, sanctions became more frequent, broader, easier to justify. What once required extraordinary circumstances became routine. Entire sectors were targeted, then entire economies. Each use normalized the next. What was sold as protection slowly became pressure. What was described as rules-based order became enforcement by exclusion, and the line between security and coercion blurred until it barely existed at all. By the time 2022 arrived, the infrastructure was already in place. The legal authority existed, the political will existed, the precedent existed. Using SWIFT and the dollar as weapons didn't feel radical. It felt obvious. That's the danger of normalized power. It doesn't feel like abuse when it's gradual. It feels like responsibility, like stewardship, like doing what must be done. But when protection turns into threat, trust doesn't vanish in protest. It disappears in preparation. What begins as protection always becomes temptation. When the cutoff finally came, Russia didn't respond with outrage. It responded with execution. Years of preparation moved from theory to reality. Payment routes that had once been backups became primary. Trade that had always defaulted to dollars was rewritten in other currencies. Energy exports were redirected east and south. Buyers adjusted, sellers adjusted, banks adjusted. None of this was elegant, none of it was efficient. But it worked. Russia expanded domestic payment systems, it leaned on bilateral agreements, it settled trade in yuan, rupees, rubles, whatever cleared. Gold reserves acted as ballast, capital controls slowed outflows, interest rates were raised aggressively to stabilize confidence. The result wasn't prosperity, it was survival, and that was the point. A country that was supposed to be economically erased proved something far more dangerous than strength. It proved escape was possible, that the dollar SWIFT system, once believed inescapable, could be routed around under pressure. This is the moment most people misunderstand. The lesson wasn't that Russia was resilient. The lesson was that the system wasn't absolute, that with enough preparation, enough motivation, and enough time, dependence could be reduced. That proof mattered more than any speech, because once survival is demonstrated, fear spreads in the opposite direction. The fear shifts from the target to the observers, from what if we're sanctioned to what if we're next. The impossible had just been done. The most important reaction didn't come from Russia. It came from everyone who wasn't sanctioned. China watched closely, not with anger but with calculation. So did India. So did Saudi Arabia. So did countries that had spent decades balancing relationships rather than choosing sides. And they all reached the same conclusion. They didn't need to oppose the system. They just needed to stop depending on it. What followed wasn't loud. There were no press conferences announcing a break from the dollar, no declarations of independence from SWIFT. That would have been reckless. Instead, there were quiet adjustments. Reserves were diversified. Dollar exposure was trimmed, not eliminated. Gold purchases increased. Trade deals were rewritten to allow settlement in local currencies. Payment systems that once handled domestic transactions were expanded for cross-border use. China accelerated its alternatives. The Gulf states began accepting payments outside dollars. BRICS countries discussed shared settlement frameworks. Even U.S. allies started asking uncomfortable questions about concentration risk. This wasn't ideology, it was insurance. No country wanted to wake up one morning and discover its reserves were inaccessible. No central bank wanted to explain why money considered safe had suddenly become political. So they hedged incrementally, quietly, rationally, because exits aren't announced, they're prepared. And by the time the shift becomes visible in the data, the decision has already been made. No one announces an exit. By the time the numbers started to change, the outcome was already locked in. The dollar was still dominant, but less so. SWIFT was still widely used, but no longer unavoidable. The system hadn't collapsed, it had weakened. And weakness in infrastructure doesn't announce itself with panic, it shows up as options. The dollar's share of global reserves began to slide faster, not because countries were abandoning it in protest, but because they were reducing exposure in advance. Central banks didn't need to sell everything, they only needed to stop buying as much. That alone was enough. Trade settlement followed the same path. Deals that once defaulted to dollars now included alternatives. Energy contracts priced in other currencies. Bilateral trade bypassed traditional clearing routes. Each individual change looked small. Together they were structural. SWIFT message volumes continued to rise in absolute terms, and that confused many observers. But share matters more than size. Growth in alternative systems began outpacing growth in the old one. Redundancy became permanence. This is how power erodes. Not when a system stops working, but when it stops being necessary. Sanctions still exist, the dollar still circulates, SWIFT still operates, but the leverage behind them has diminished. The threat that once felt absolute now carries an asterisk. Targets prepare. Neutrals hedge. Allies reconsider. A weapon that works only once isn't a weapon anymore. It's a lesson. And once that lesson is learned, it can't be unlearned. Weapons only work before defenses exist. When Britain lost reserve currency status, it took 3 decades. From the first financial weaponization in 1914 to formal replacement in 1944, the decline was slow, grinding, and stretched across 2 world wars. Alternatives took years to build. Information traveled slowly. Capital moved cautiously. Systems changed at the pace of ships and letters. That world no longer exists. Today, financial infrastructure scales at the speed of software. Payment systems don't take generations to mature, they take versions. Reserves can be shifted with a few keystrokes. Trade routes can be renegotiated in months, not decades. What once required wars and treaties now requires incentives and code. This is why the current transition won't mirror Britain's timeline. It will compress it. In the early 20th century, neutral countries had few real alternatives to London. In the 21st, alternatives already exist. They aren't perfect, they aren't dominant, but they don't need to be. They only need to function well enough to reduce dependence. Technology accelerates everything. A system doesn't need to replace the dollar to weaken it. It only needs to offer an escape hatch. Once that hatch exists, confidence shifts, behavior changes, momentum builds. That's why the question isn't whether the dollar disappears. It won't. The question is how long it remains uncontested. Based on historical patterns and modern acceleration, the window isn't centuries. It's not even generations. It's measured in decades. 15 to 25 years from the moment the weapon was used. History speeds up when systems scale. In every transition like this, power doesn't vanish into thin air. It changes hands. The country best positioned for that transfer isn't the one making the most noise. It's the one building patiently, quietly, while others burn credibility. And in this shift, the advantage is obvious. China doesn't need to defeat the United States militarily. It doesn't need to replace the dollar overnight. It only needs to offer something the world increasingly wants: optionality. A second system, a second route, a second choice. China has the scale, the manufacturing base, the trade volume, and now, increasingly, the financial plumbing. Payment systems that don't rely on Western clearing, currency swap agreements that bypass dollars entirely, trade settled directly, without asking permission from New York. This isn't conquest, it's inheritance. Middle powers benefit too. Countries like India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and others gain leverage simply by having alternatives. They don't have to choose sides. They can balance, negotiate, play systems against each other. That's real power. In a multipolar currency world, no single country dictates terms. Influence becomes negotiated rather than enforced. The ability to say no quietly becomes more valuable than the ability to threaten loudly. And the most important thing to understand is this: none of these countries are anti-American. They're risk-aware. They watched reserves frozen. They watched access revoked. And they decided never to be exposed like that. No war required. Every shift of power has a cost. And in this one, the bill doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives slowly, spread across years, hidden inside prices, interest rates, and expectations. Quiet enough that it's easy to dismiss until it isn't. For the United States, dollar dominance has provided an extraordinary privilege. The ability to run large deficits without immediate consequence, to borrow cheaply, to import more than it exports and pay with its own currency, to absorb shocks that would crush smaller economies. That privilege is fading. As global demand for dollars softens, borrowing becomes more expensive. Foreign buyers don't disappear overnight, they just demand better terms. Higher yields, shorter maturities. Less trust by default. Inflation becomes harder to export. When fewer countries need dollars, excess dollars stay home. Prices rise. Purchasing power erodes, not catastrophically, persistently. For anyone holding dollar-denominated assets, the loss is subtle but real. Bonds that pay interest but lose value to inflation. Savings that feel stable but buy less each year. Wealth that doesn't vanish, it thins. This isn't collapse. It's normalization. The United States doesn't become poor. It becomes ordinary. A large, wealthy country without the ability to shift costs onto the rest of the world. Consumption adjusts. Expectations reset. Political tension rises as promises become harder to fund. This is what the end of monetary privilege looks like. Not panic, not chaos, just limits. And the free lunch always ends. History gives the same warning every time. It doesn't shout it, it doesn't dramatize it, it simply repeats the pattern and waits to see who notices. Financial weapons feel irresistible because they promise control without sacrifice. No soldiers, no rebuilding, no occupation, just pressure applied through systems that already exist. On paper, it looks clean, efficient, modern, and it works. Once, after that, it teaches everyone how to escape. Britain learned this lesson in 1914 when it froze assets and shattered the illusion that money was neutral. The United States learned it in 1979 when it froze Iranian reserves and revealed that dollars came with political conditions. And in 2022, the lesson was broadcast to the entire world in real time. Financial power is different from military power. You can deploy an army again and again, but financial weapons rely on trust, and trust only survives until it's broken publicly. Once reserves are frozen, every country starts counting exposure. Once access is revoked, every system begins building redundancy. Once the precedent is set, fear spreads faster than policy ever could. This is the part empires always miss. They believe strength enforces obedience. In reality, it accelerates preparation. The more visibly power is used, the faster others learn to live without it. Decline doesn't come from rebellion. It comes from quiet adaptation. Empires fall quietly. In the future, historians won't debate the exact month the dollar began to weaken. They'll point to a moment, February 2022, not because it marked collapse, but because it marked exposure. The day the world saw, in plain terms, how financial power was actually enforced and what that enforcement cost. The swift cutoff was meant to demonstrate dominance. Instead, it revealed fragility. It showed that the system holding global trade together wasn't neutral infrastructure, but political leverage. And once that illusion broke, it could never be fully repaired. This doesn't mean the dollar disappears. It means it shares space. It competes. It loses the privilege of being unquestioned. The world doesn't abandon it in anger. It moves away in caution. Slowly at first, then faster. The tools that once guaranteed obedience now generate alternatives. The sanctions that once forced compliance now encourage independence. The weapons that once enforced order now limit their own use. That's the irony history never gets tired of repeating. The United States didn't lose financial dominance because someone took it. It lost it because it used it. And in doing so, it taught the world how to build around it. If you understand this pattern, you understand the next 20 years of global power. You see why the dollar weakens, why alternatives rise, and why the shift feels gradual but unstoppable. This isn't prediction, it's recognition. If you see the pattern, you're already ahead.